Welcome to episode 104 of the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're going to be talking with Sowser, who's one of the flayers and moderators of the Ask Historians subreddit. He specializes mostly in slavery in the British Caribbean. Today we're going to be talking about forms of resistance to different forms of exploitation, including slavery but not limited to slavery in the British Caribbean. And specifically, it's going to be a case study of several very important rebellions in Jamaica. Now, before we begin, we're going to, of course, be doing the book raffle. It's the beginning of the month. This month's winner is Ross Jensen. Ross, congratulations, and thanks for supporting the podcast. The books we're going to be giving away this month, or you get to select one of three, of course, are Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. We discussed the book in the podcast, so it seemed appropriate to offer it. This is a classic of historiography on the relationship between capitalism and slavery, and it would be useful to read it while keeping in mind Sowser's critique of the book in the podcast. While it's somewhat outdated in some aspects, it is certainly worth a read, and there's still a lot of it that holds true. Another of the books we're going to be offering is Professor Manuel Barcia's West African Warfare in Bahia and Cuba, Soldier Slaves in the Atlantic World, 1807 to 1844. Professor Barcia is Professor of History at the University of Leeds in the UK, and he focuses on history of slave resistance. His work has two very important common threads, one of which is attempts to show continuity between the culture, the world outlook, and the forms of warfare and resistance of Africans in Africa and enslaved Africans in the Americas. It's a very interesting connection that is often lost, or at least not touched upon that much in most of the historiography that I've read on the topic. Barcia's work tries to paint them in their full, rich, and complex human dimension, and the nuance and the compromise that was inherent in having to survive under the regime of modern slavery. Finally, we're going to offer Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World, 1400 to 1800. It's a book by John Thornton. His book is, in essence, an attempt to summarize the ways in which Africa and Africans have shaped the development of the Atlantic world during, modernity. It's a very interesting book. It definitely broke a lot of the assumptions that I had about the topic, and it's definitely worth a read as a good introduction. If you'd like to support the podcast and thereby enter the raffle every month, you can go to patreon.com/AskHistorians. With that said, let's start the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're here with Sowser from the subreddit. Sowser is our expert in slavery in the US and British Caribbean. Sowser, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
So before we begin, I'm sure that a couple of our loyal listeners have heard your intro from the previous episode you did with us, but just tell us a little bit about yourself.
I mean, the previous episode was very nearly 2 years ago, so it might have been a while. If you've been listening since episode 59 at least, congratulations and thank you. So yeah, I don't really know what to say about myself. I'm a historian, as you may have guessed from the theme of the podcast, and I look at slavery in the British Caribbean and also the United States from a primarily theoretical perspective. So what is slavery? How is it constructed? Why is it different to other kinds of forced labour that have existed around the world? And from a labour perspective rather than, say, a racial perspective. So I'm very interested in the dynamics of slavery as a system of organising work and how people experience that system and relate to that system, mostly from the point of view of the victims rather than the perpetrators. But I'm a bit, I'm not as intensely involved in all of the kind of the racial stuff that you get very heavily, especially in US slavery discourse right now. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and on the subreddit, one of the things that Sowser is also very famous for are his takedowns of the Irish slavery myth.
Yes, there are 4 of them in the FAQ, I think. My top all-time post is my main takedown of Irish slavery, but I think it's also like my 3rd one, so it's my least patience one that basically says, no, you're wrong. Here's why you're wrong. I am sick of this. But yeah, so I'm glad that's one of my legacies.
Now, today we're going to be talking specifically about Black resistance to labor exploitation in the Caribbean, and specifically kind of a case study of Jamaica. And as listeners can probably already guess from the wording of the title, we're not just going to be looking at slavery. We're also going to be looking at other forms of labor exploitation that are post-slavery. So, yeah. So, Sowser, what can you tell us about the research and historiography of slave resistance?
So it's a slightly weird one in that there's quite a lot written in the United States. Most people listening to this will have probably at some point heard of a man called Nat Turner, if they're American. His rebellion in the US is very, very famous. There is a lot of scholarship on what's happened elsewhere in the world, but it's not really all brought together anywhere in one place, or certainly hasn't been very much. This history of slavery in the Caribbean is very fragmented according to linguistic lines. So people like me who look at the British Caribbean tend to be shamelessly monolingual Brits who don't know Spanish or French and so can't look at that material. And then in the United States, people are obviously very concerned with different patterns between different states, and they don't tend to look so much over to what's happening across the water. Probably the only one that transcends all of the different language and geographical barriers is obviously the Haitian Revolution, which is considered in many ways the most successful slave revolt because it leads to enslaved people literally taking a whole country off a European power and ultimately creating their own republic. But the history of the whole is quite fragmented, and people who study slavery comparatively know quite a lot about it. And in the British Caribbean, there's been a lot said about slave resistance and slave uprisings, but it doesn't really spread much beyond our little bubble, which is kind of why I wanted to do this episode, which is not going to be looking at any kind of instance in particular in very, very great detail, but look at some broad patterns that we can pick out from 3, if I have time at the end, very briefly 4, incidents of, not so much slave, but certainly black working class resistance, let's say. Let's play fast and loose with the words working class and use that as our broad descriptor throughout this quite long stretch of time.
Sounds great. Before we begin, I do want to ask, one question. There's been a lot of, on the subreddit, there has been discussion of the different ways that historians have approached the slavery and slave resistance as well. And so, for example, you have the one extreme, which is, of course, kind of not mentioning them. More traditional, especially 19th century sources may not really mention it unless the slave rebellion is particularly significant, like Haiti. But then you also have the other extreme end of the spectrum, which is kind of a idealized proletariat kind of historiography, which is also not necessarily capturing all the nuance of...
Yes.
Yeah, so would you say that the historiography of last 2 decades or so is kind of find more of a healthy equilibrium between the 2 extremes?
I would actually say that the historians of enslaved, it depends on how we're defining resistance. If we're focusing on violent uprising, I wouldn't necessarily say that a whole lot has changed, because I think that kind of history is losing its vogue. There's only so much you can say about violent uprising after violent uprising, especially because they're not terribly well documented in most cases. We focus on a handful of big instances, even though we've known in the case of the United States, since at least the 1940s, that there are at least 250 notable slave revolts throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, but most of them are recorded as there was a revolt. We killed everyone, which isn't very useful for study. And the debates in wider slavery studies are kind of moving past this and looking much more at nuanced resistance on an individual level, on a family level, on a community level, stuff like, reevaluating the role of women and religion and looking at community building as resistance, which is something I'm very, very big on. But I think in the popular mind, obviously, people are more interested in that question of, did people ever try to violently resist? And if not, why not? And if so, how successful could they be? So I think in that sense, the Academy I think there's more work to be done, and I'm not really sure off the top of my head how I would characterise where we are with it. I certainly think in the British Caribbean, our understanding is quite nuanced, because we have a handful of big instances that we've talked about again and again and again, and we've had these debates where, one of the instances we're going to talk about, there is a massive debate, and there has been for a long time, over whether or not it's a riot, or a rebellion, or a revolt, and if these three things are all the same, or if they're different. So we'll get into that a bit later, I think.
Perfect. And I think the first example instance you're going to talk about is going to be the first Maroon War, correct?
Yes, it is. You may gather from the name that there was not just one Maroon War, air quotes. And something you're going to notice in two of these three instances that we're talking about today is that the term that's used in historiography is war, which is not generally the language you use when you think about a revolt or a revolution, unless it's something on the scale of the American Revolution. And the fact that we call these events, we use these contemporary terms, the First Maroon War, Second Maroon War, Baptist War, because it reflects the extent to which the conflict as it was happening was seen to threaten the fabric of the colony in question. So the First Maroon War, when it begins, depends on who you ask. There are varying dates that say it lasted anywhere between 10 years and 90 years. And the reason for that is what we could call the First Maroon War begins in 1655. Now, that's a date you might recognise, I'm not sure, because in 1655, Jamaica was called, I think, Santiago. Please don't laugh at the accent I said there. And it was controlled by the Spanish. And in 1655, the British come along and kind of look at Jamaica and think, we want that, we're going to have that. And there's a reason why until 1872, Jamaica's capital is not Kingston, it's a place called Spanish Town, because it was the Spanish town. It's very imaginatively named. And when Britain comes along and starts, shooting at the Spaniards and the Spaniards start shooting back, the Spanish slaves on the island at the time see an opportunity here. And they think, while the white people are all killing each other, we are going to rise up on the estates, we are going to run away, and we are going to hope that if we can hide in the jungle for long enough, we'll come back and they'll all be dead and this island will be ours, is essentially what happens. And these people become known as the Maroons, which is a word with a Spanish origin, but I can't think what it is off the top of my head. Don't suppose you happen to know what it would be.
Cimarron.
Okay, that makes sense. Very similar.
It's spelled like cimarron, like it kind of spelled like cinnamon, cimarron, but it's the accent is on the O at the end, cimarron.
Okay. And what would that mean in Spanish?
Runaway slave.
Oh, literally. There we go. That's where it comes from. See, you've taught me something now. This is what I'm saying, the linguistic barriers. I am completely monolingual. I don't know these things. I just know Maroons. Okay, that's a weird name. So these people flee into an area of Jamaica called the Blue Mountains. Now, a lot of people will be familiar today with Blue Mountain coffee. The Blue Mountains have this very, very fertile soil, which is just perfect for growing all kinds of different crops. But at the time, it was extremely difficult to access on foot because it was just filled with jungle. The climate was even more horrible than the rest of Jamaica's climate can be. And these fleeing slaves take advantage of this and they start building their own communities. Now, at first, these are very small. And actually, the Spanish pragmatically make a deal with these Maroons and sort of say, help us fight the English and we might leave you in peace when they're gone. Not all of these Maroons do that, but some of them certainly do. Of course, as we know, the British end up winning. The Spanish abandon the island after what is quite a protracted struggle, and it becomes a British colony. By 1661, there's a British government in place, a local government based on the island with its own elected parliament called the House of Assembly. And these enslaved people have now had half a decade to bed themselves down in the interior of the island. And initially, this isn't a huge problem for the British. They have more important things to worry about. They've just taken this island through conquest, and they have investments to make, buildings to repair. They need to make sure the island is filled with their own people. So they kind of leave these Maroons to their own devices as long as they don't bother the British. But as time goes on, and Britain is using slave labour in Jamaica, enslaved people who are still on the estates are very aware that in the jungle there are these black people who are starting to take on some semi-mythical status as freedom fighters, people who are defying the white man. And whenever we see big slave revolts in this period, they're not generally trying to overthrow their owners and take control of the island. They are trying to get away for long enough to flee into the jungle and find these Maroon communities. And so over the course of 60, 70 years, every time there's a slave revolt involving 100 or 200 people, they are fleeing into the jungle, joining these communities and becoming bigger and bigger and more prominent, to the point where after, I think, 20, 30 years, there is a second major Maroon faction on the other side of the island that has nothing to do with the original Maroon faction who appeared during the war to control the island. And they have their own leaders. At least one of these there end up being 5 major communities. At least one is holding elections to determine who its leader should be, electing a queen who serves for life and is then replaced, we think, by another queen after another election and so on. It's a very fascinating phenomenon. But as time is going on, sorry, go on.
Yeah, wait, sorry, just to interrupt you. Out of curiosity, do you know, do we have any idea if, where this is this an adaptation of some kind of a political system used in one of the regions that the enslaved Africans had come from?
Yes. So we don't know tremendous amounts about the leaders of these Maroons. What we do know comes from very compromised colonial accounts or from very, very fragmented, and we think perhaps censored or mythologized oral history. But certainly one of the main encampments becomes known as Nanny Town. And there is this mythical figure in Jamaican history called Nanny of the Maroons. And she is supposedly one of these elected queens of this community. There's a debate as to whether or not Nanny is her name or her title, but the whole political structure is thought to be inspired by, I think, practices in tribal organization in Ghana. And because the slave community who founded that particular cropping of Maroons, the people who escaped were all from Ghana. And so they attempted to recreate something of their own culture there, but undoubtedly coloured by the experience of slavery and by, in their mind, being perpetually at war and always on the defensive. So probably a more authoritarian, rigid structure maybe than a communal one. But we don't know if Nanny of the Maroons... The popular thing is to imagine her as this one woman who was a very prominent leader, achieved loads of cool things. But given that we know she died at least twice in a 10-year period, it seems likely, if you believe the records, that there was more than one woman who perhaps started assuming an identity that was inherited.
Makes sense. Like Caesar starts as a name, then it becomes a title.
Precisely, that may well have been the case, and there were probably many women who were called Nanny in these communities. It's a grandmotherly, matronly title, that would be logical to adopt in English. But there's a mix between them. We only know of one town that definitely had a woman leader consistently. The others appear to have all had male leaders. And as time is going on, the British authorities in Jamaica are starting to be driven insane because as these communities get bigger, they get bolder. They are raiding estates. They are stealing food. They are stealing resources. They are harassing the British troops on the island quite cleverly, actually. They've had decades to learn the local geography. And whenever sort of British patrols are veering a bit too far beyond what the Maroons see as the acceptable boundary of the white man, they will strike and terrorise these patrols as a lesson to the authorities. This obviously does not go down very well with the British. And so the British decide around about the 1720s, after successes of failures by the white elite on the island to try and deal with these Maroons, that they're going to send more troops, put more investment in, and so about 1728 the Maroon War proper begins, which sees the British actually going out of their way, trying to penetrate the interior of the island to destroy these communities actively, and generally it's a miserable failure. Because these people, they know the terrain, they use very sophisticated guerrilla warfare tactics. They, have one person appear in the distance to spook the Brits, and when they all follow cautiously, the next thing they know, they've been led into some dark piece of jungle and they're surrounded by Maroons who then kill them one by one, steal their weapons, steal their supplies, etc. And the fascinating thing, and why I wanted to highlight this example, this is it's a war in the sense that the British are under siege. They feel like they're being besieged by these terrifying, in their mind, black savages in the jungle. It's almost like a chunk of Africa has come to them and they can't control it. They can't civilize it in their mind, and they don't know what to do. And they don't know what to do about it. And they just keep throwing men at the problem, throwing weapons at the problem, and it doesn't work out. But at the same time, what is happening inside the Maroon leadership is they are convinced that it's only a matter of time until the full might of the British Army comes to get them. Because they have seen this island in their oral history fall from one European power to another European power. And that superior power is the one that is now coming for them. And they actually decide, under the auspices of a man called Cujo, in the eastern half of the island, that they want to make a peace deal with the British. Which is a very bold move, because, you're a bunch of black rebels who've escaped slavery, who are helping other slaves to escape slavery, and you want to make peace with your white colonial oppressors. Because of the sheer amount of effort and how badly the campaign is going, the British actually agree. The British in 1739, even though they had 6 years earlier destroyed one of the 5 main Maroon colonies and scattered their people back into other Maroon settlements, sign a peace deal with Cujo. And in that deal, they say, we will guarantee your autonomy. We will recognize you as some kind of political entity distinct to Jamaica. That is to say, not under the authorities of the white government in Jamaica, but under the authority of the Crown in London. You will remain on good ties with us. We expect to hear from you once a year to make sure you're still there, and that there's nothing we need to renegotiate, which sounds a bit like something that happens in Battlestar Galactica now that I think about it, but that's a different issue. But here's the interesting thing. You will return any enslaved person who flees to the jungle to join you. And the Maroons agree to that term. And what is fascinating is that there is a point in those 80 years of warfare with the British where the Maroon leadership, certainly on the east of the island, has come to view itself less as African, less as black, and more as Maroon. And they are now fighting for the survival of the Maroons rather than to resist the British authorities. But through their successes, they are forcing the British authorities to recognise their existence, to abandon the idea that they will ever control a vast chunk of Jamaica, despite their superior firepower, despite their numbers, because it simply isn't worth the casualties and the damage to property that prosecuting that war to its end will cause.
It's definitely interesting. I've heard this this phenomenon referred to in some sources, some other historians as well, but it's interesting to hear about the way in which it starts as a war against slavery, but then it just becomes like war against their own enslavement or re-enslavement, and not necessarily a war where the objective is to end all slavery, which is perhaps what Haiti ended up as.
Yes, and it's one of those where it's annoying where you wish these people had been able to write down everything that was going in their mind so you could then read it. We think that in the western half of the island this caused some outrage, because the western half of the island is where the British had the most success prosecuting this war, and that probably, perhaps the woman who was called Nanny, whichever version of her it was, did have an ideological agenda of wanting to get rid of the British and end slavery and liberate as many people as possible. But when the Eastern Maroons made this deal with the British, their power base was taken away. They knew they couldn't do it alone. They had to be united. And so the other Maroon settlements follow over the course of a few years in signing additional treaties, and one by one the British somewhat pacified each community, because every time one of them drops out and makes peace with the British, the chances of the war succeeding, whatever their end goal is, whether it's survival or the end of slavery, fades. So certainly by at least there was at least one major faction who were just interested in their own survival. They no longer cared about abolishing slavery. And once they go out, the Maroons, who may have been more committed to that goal, we think, have to give up and acquiesce to the terms Britain gives.
So this is definitely a side of I'm at least familiar with the war, but it's definitely a different side to the Maroon War than I'm familiar with. It honestly reminds me a bit about Palmares in Brazil, the Palmares rebellion, or I'm not sure what exactly to call it, the fugitive community, which does something similar in northeastern Brazil. I'm sure you're already familiar with it. They go into the interior, they basically create their own kingdom, and it takes about 90 years
before it's finally repressed, yeah.
Until it's finally suppressed. And they have to buy off a lot of people and have to assassinate a lot the Portuguese for it to finally collapse.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's interesting is people in America, in the United States, often kind of have the question of why didn't people do this more in the US? And I think the answer is that in the case of both Brazil and in Jamaica, and not just the British Caribbean in general, but particularly in the case of Jamaica, it is about geography. The US doesn't have the geography that allowed people to really do this effectively. The way the American plantation economy was scattered and structured, if you managed to make it off a plantation, there was so far you had to go before you found the kind of land that you could grow crops in, hide convincingly in, not be disturbed regularly by patrols in, that it was simply borderline impossible. It probably did happen in parts of the US, in marshland, for example, which was much harder to control near rice plantations, but probably not for any prolonged period of time. And even in the British Caribbean, in an island like Barbados, it would be much, much harder to do something like this than in Jamaica, which has these massive mountains, vast, dense jungle. It's like the island off Lost in the 18th, 19th century. You can literally get lost in there and find, mysterious numbers and radio towers if you want to, but it's a very similar kind of situation where the interior of the island was just so inhospitable, there was no worth exploring it. No one knew at this time the Blue Mountains were going to become a great agricultural and economic boon to Jamaica in the distant future, but the people who became the Maroons did, and they took advantage. And they were lucky that it was also very well sheltered.
Yeah, Cuba actually also proves your point to an extent, because when slave rebellions occurred in the area around Havana's in this large plain between the mountains in the furthest western part of the island, which is in what is today Pinar del Rio, and one of the lesser mountain ranges, which is in the center of the country. Between that's the area of Havana Matanzas, and that's largely plains. And all the slave rebellions there got suppressed pretty quickly. But in the eastern provinces, which is also where you have the guerrilla war against Batista, which was successful in the middle of the 20th century, you had palenques, which are cimarrón, or runaway slave communities, which existed for years and years in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra in the east. So geography is apparently very important.
Yeah, it is. It's the only way, there's no way to, again, to use the Lost analogy, to get off the island. You're trapped. So unless you have a place where you can forge a new destiny, which means being able to grow your own crops without suspicion, or being able to hunt, or being able to forage, which is a tall order for a big community if you can't grow stuff, your attempt at a rebellion is probably doomed unless you go down the Haitian route of going all out and trying to take control of the entire colony, which is also easier said than done on an island like Jamaica, because if a revolt starts in one plantation on the western side of the colony, by the time you make it to the eastern side, the authorities will be extremely well organized. They will know what's happening. There's no way you can spread a revolution that well, because Jamaica's communication and transport links are just appalling. But it is sorry, go on.
No, and I imagine the part that they do control well is also less mountainous.
Yes, it's mostly flat plains that are ideal for having plantations growing crops, which are good for connections to the towns, to the coast and stuff. And geography will become relevant in the third example we talk about shortly. But the reason why I wanted to highlight this one was because it's a great example of how these very plucky, clever, brave black people were able to go off in defiance of all the white stereotypes about African people and their descendants and build these fantastic communities and defend them so well that they make the British Empire put its hands up and say, do you know what? This just is not worth it. This is not worth fighting over. We're going to let you live in peace. Just leave us alone. And it's fantastic. But it's also a fantastic case study of how their survival as a community came to take precedence over the survival of black people on the island or the freedom of black people on the island. And the Maroons do honour those treaties. They do not always, but generally return enslaved people who escaped to them, which goes down very unwell with the enslaved population, as you can imagine, and with a lot of the free black population, as small as it is.
I can imagine. And the Maroon War happens. We've got this kind of stable peace, more or less, going on. And then what happens next?
So what happens next is that there is actually another big revolt, which I don't want to talk about today, but it's called Tacky's War, and that happens in 1760. Also called Tacky's Rebellion. We like calling things wars in the British Caribbean. It's just what we do. And I'm not going to talk much about that, but that was another, if you want to go and ask about that later or look that up, that is definitely worth investigating. Nanny Maroons comes into that story as well in one of her many dozen lives, with some of them where she dies at 30, some of them where she dies at 330, I think. But what we want to move on to next is an event called the Baptist War, which happens in 1831 and 1832. And the reason why I picked the Baptist War is, firstly, because we have limited time. We can't talk about all of them. But it is an event which plays a decisive role in Britain actually abolishing slavery when it did. And it is a fascinating case study in how the intentions of people who resist are not always read very well by the people who they are resisting. So, in the run to 1831, you get missionaries from Britain and the United States working across the British Caribbean, but especially in Jamaica, trying to convert people to different forms of Christianity. And they focus especially on black communities and on slave communities because, unlike in the United States in the 19th century, Christianization is not a thing that the planters in Jamaica are interested in. They don't particularly care that their slaves are practicing folk religion. They're quite happy to leave them to their own devices and let them get on with whatever, from their point of view, superstitious practice they have. But these missionaries come into black communities and have a very, what we might call today, liberation theology, which is very much about questioning the authority of the planters' claim, about a much greater, certainly not absolute racial equality, but a much greater role for black people within the church. And at the same time as this is happening, white people in the Caribbean who own slaves are doing something extremely stupid, which is when, Mr. and Mrs. Slave Owner are having their dinner with black servants around them serving them food, they are having conversations about how they are concerned by the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, about how they are concerned that there are more and more anti-slavery MPs in Parliament, about how they are concerned by the rise in abolitionist societies in England, completely oblivious to the fact that these black servants who are serving them are then going back to their families, going back to their homes, and telling everyone the British are coming. Britain is on our side. They're trying to get rid of slavery. It's one of those that's just, you wouldn't think people could be that daft. But that was the power of racist ideology. They genuinely believed that their black servants were so stupid or so loyal or both that they could have these conversations around them, and there's no way it could come back to bite them in the backside. So this coincides as well with a tightening of slavery. The British government has been making the slave owners try and treat their slaves better by passing amelioration legislation. Things like, you get an extra day off here, you can't be worked as often. If you're pregnant, you should get compulsory allowances for this kind of care and so on. And by 1831, the plantocracy is starting to pare back on some of those promises. And one of the big things that enslaved people find is a step too far is they cut the length of the Christmas break that enslaved people have from 3 days to 2 days. And so a man called Samuel Sharp, who was a Baptist deacon, a Baptist preacher, who had developed a theological conviction that slavery was against the Bible, that Jesus Christ had abolished slavery when he abolished various Old Testament laws, and that the Bible taught racial equality, decides that after the Christmas break in 1831, they are going to go on strike in his community. And he is able to organise a very large-scale, basically general strike across the island by using the network that the Baptist church he was in gave him access to, because he was a very rare example in the Caribbean of a very well-educated, literate, enslaved man who was probably some kind of, very senior servant on his estate and very, very well treated, fought very loyal and upstanding, and one of the, kind of exceptions that proves for rule to black inferiority, and allowed to move around and allowed to meet with other deacons. And he took advantage of this to spread this plan. And so on December 27th, 1831, in Montego Bay, a massive group of enslaved people just refuse to go to work. They say, we're on strike. And we are on strike until you say we are free people, and until you agree to pay us wages that are about half the wage that a white worker would get if they do our job. So that's a really interesting thing to do, because it kind of breaks the expectation that resistance to slavery, when it gets violent or strong, because this isn't violent yet, is always about all or nothing. You either kill all the white people and take the island, a la Haiti, or you do nothing. Samuel Sharp had a very big ambitious plan for a general strike that would grind the island's economy to a halt, and then if there were enough people involved, the whites would just have to listen because they couldn't kill all of them. Unfortunately, it didn't go quite that way. Samuel Sharp's deputies, shall we say, his lieutenants, the people who helped him, were not quite as fervent believers in his optimistic vision of the strike. And almost immediately, violence does break out in a few isolated pockets. As the rest of the island is starting to have its own uprisings, where Sharp is, there is a trashing of an estate. And at least one faction of the rebels then decide, no, screw this strike business, they're just going to kill us anyway. We need to kill them first, and start destroying property and burning houses and so on. The local militia retreats tactically and essentially sends runners to advise the white authorities what is happening. And although about 60,000 people, we think, out of 300,000 slaves may have actually gone on strike, the British government is able to, well, not British government, sorry, the colonial, the Jamaican government is able to respond very, very quickly. And by January, they are putting out public proclamations and shouting them out in streets and so on, advising people who are not in rebellion, to tell their friends and families who are, that if they surrender, they'll be left in peace. And if they don't, they will be murdered to the last man, woman and child. And it takes about 2 weeks for the British to actually put down that revolt. Yeah. So it's not a tremendous success. It's a very, very well-meaning attempt to change through peace that just goes wrong, and it goes wrong fundamentally because of the lack of organisation on the part of the leaders. Although it's incredible they got so many people involved, and it's incredible that they had such a great plan, their actual execution of the plan was woefully inadequate. However, the story doesn't end there. The Jamaican authorities, I need to stop confusing Jamaica and Britain, because I'm trying to say the British colonists, but they're Jamaicans. The Jamaican authorities then wage this intense campaign of terror on the local population. Hundreds and hundreds of people are brought in for summary trials, usually 3 or 4 at a time. Half of them are found guilty of capital offences, the other half are given jail sentences. At least 300 to 400 black people, many of who were probably not even organisers, but just in the wrong place at the wrong time, are executed, usually by hanging rather than shooting. Sharp himself is executed in May 1832. He doesn't actually regret what happens. He's actually proud of what they ended up doing, because he did believe that violence might have to unfold if the authorities reacted with violence. He just didn't want it to be. And he ultimately blamed them rather than his own lieutenants for kind of getting off the hoof. And to be fair, we will never know for sure how that estate was sacked and whether or not, the rebels were acting in self-defense first. But this gets back to Britain, and the stories of the brutality involved horrify the British middle class. They're reading in newspapers, the rebellion itself gets painted as a violent uprising by these uncivilized, savage blacks, but the racial ideology of the white elite in Jamaica and the Caribbean have been clinging to and trying to aggressively defend in the public eye as they think the abolition of slavery is getting nearer, comes back to bite them in the backside, because essentially a lot of people in Britain say, well, hang on, if you've told us this whole time that they were just riotous, unruly, violent, degraded creatures who don't know what they're doing and need white people to look after them, why are you responding with such horrific violence? Why does the Morning Chronicle have stories about enslaved women and their children being beaten to death in the street? And the other mistake the white elite make is they think, these Baptists have put our slaves up to this. These preachers, we're going to go and burn their churches. We're going to go and feather and tar the white preachers, which also looks extremely bad because the Colonial Office does not want a white civil war in one of its colonies. It has already had very sour experiences with white people turning on white people in the British Empire. It does not want it to happen in Jamaica. And the Jamaican elite very quickly find that whatever patience the British government had for them evaporates almost overnight. And it is a big, big factor in the debate around the passage of the abolition of slavery legislation in the early 1830s. So, although the revolt was a catastrophic failure in terms of its ability to make immediate change on the ground and led to some horrific crimes against humanity, it is a success in the sense that it is a big factor in accelerating the timetable of the abolition of slavery. So in a way, Samuel Sharp did have his victory. He did get his freedom. Black people didn't get their fair wage for a very long time after that, but they did get their liberty. They did get emancipation, admittedly over several years. But it's an interesting example of a personal Pyrrhic victory, but ultimately a triumph that really massively, massively shifts political discourse in England.
Yeah, and it also contrasts with how the declaration of the at least the beginning of the end of slavery is 1833, right?
Yeah.
Right. And it really contrasts with the way that date is usually used, especially in politics, because it's also often used as, look, in this very enlightened way, the British ended the slave trade in 1807, and look, they ended slavery in their colonies voluntarily, in this act of enlightened, whatever, in 1833. No, it took the massacre of, sounds like thousands of people.
Yes, it certainly will have been. We know the number of judicial killings. We don't know the number of extrajudicial killings, but they were probably very high. There were 60,000 people involved in this revolt in some way, shape or form. Most of those just work stoppage, not people involved in violent crime. But we know, sort of the story I mentioned about the woman being murdered in the street, that does not appear in the court records. So probably, yes, at least 1,000 people, quite possibly more. And a handful of white people as well who were probably falsely implicated, who probably didn't actually do anything. We know that some of the white Baptists were absolutely horrified when they realised that they may have helped shape what was happening. But it's not, it would be wrong to say there was a peaceful abolition of slavery in the British Caribbean. This really, really unsettled the authorities and really helped put the nail in the coffin for slavery by showing the British government not just that very clearly the Caribbean is a ticking time bomb. It is only a matter of time until there is another bigger violent revolt that we won't make it across the ocean in time to stop. It is also the case that the white governments in the Caribbean can no longer effectively manage this system. They have lost perspective, and we need to control them as well.
Out of curiosity, what do you think of, and it's been a while since I read him, but in Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, I think, if I recall correctly, one of the points he makes about the abolition of slavery in the early 19th century is that, at least in the British Caribbean, is that the planter class, which in the 17th century and part of the 18th century, which had done so well, it had been able to achieve political influence back in England. They had been able to many had achieved big enough fortunes they could ennoble themselves. That planter class had kind of lost steam and lost political influence as much of the best land for sugar production had been exhausted. They're not, the returns aren't as big as they used to be. And, of course, the uptick in the cost of slavery was cutting down on their profits and their ability to buy political influence. Do you think that theory holds, or is that...
Parts of it do, parts of it don't. So
also, note to listeners, this is as I'm remembering it. If I'm misrepresenting Eric Williams, my apologies.
Yeah, Williams is a weird one in that he's the grandfather of the economic history of slavery and of the British Caribbean. The important thing that I always stress with Eric Williams, and it is something that kind of gets overlooked, and with early British Caribbean historians in general, is that they were usually politicians as well. They usually had an agenda. So Eric Williams is probably more famous for a lot of people in the Caribbean, not as, the person who comes up with these great theories on capitalism, but as the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. So I would always urge people to keep that in mind, that they're often very political figures and they're not writing the kind of academic history that we think of today. His thesis is essentially, it's half sound, it's half not. So Williams's whole idea is that slavery was essential to the development of capitalism, and it was only really abolished once a more rigorous capitalist economy could develop. It doesn't really work that way, actually. The planters are fighting to the bitter end to preserve this system, and they are fighting to preserve it because it is still profitable. It is still growing. Although the slave population has been declining in the British Caribbean, and although sugar production is suffering, it is also there are areas where they are starting to get over these problems. In Barbados, they have just figured out at the time of abolition how to boost the reproduction rate of their enslaved population to get people to basically have more kids and die less. So the idea that slavery was just in decline and would kind of give way to some other exploitative system eventually anyway, I'm really not convinced is true. I am convinced that it was a hard time economically for the planters and for enslaved people themselves, definitely. This whole stretch of time, the 1820s to the 1870s, 80s, is actually a horrible economic time for the Caribbean for a whole variety of reasons, quite a few of which are outside of anyone's control, things like natural disaster and so on. So half and half is my cop-out of an answer.
No, but that's good to keep in mind. And it is good to contrast classics in the field like Eric Williams with, more contemporary historiography. Yeah. So, as you say, this is a kind of, Pyrrhic victory for the planters. The planter class, they suppress the rebellion, but it's so politically costly that it ends up accelerating the timetable on abolition. Abolition is declared 1833. What is the? I know that in other parts of the Americas, when slavery is abolished, oftentimes you'll find kind of a halfway system, not quite free, not quite enslaved, which is established. Is that also true of Jamaica?
It's true of the entire British Caribbean. So the legislation that is passed in Parliament, I talked about this in episode 59, by the way. So for more detail, go there at the end of this. Yes, it's a system called apprenticeship, which is very misleading as a name. Apprenticeship implies something quite lovely and voluntary, where you develop skills. It's essentially indentured servitude. It's a fixed term contract of originally, I want to say, off the top of my head, I think 7 years. So 7 years after the formal abolition of slavery in law, formerly enslaved people will have to start working for a wage, but will still have to work. They will still have to work for their former owners. They will still have very limited protections in law compared to a genuinely free labourer. They will still have to be on the estates and so on. Conversely, their white owners, former owners, will still have to provide certain services and standards like housing and provision grounds that they would not provide to a free worker. And this system is also a disaster. Abolitionists are very quick to do a lot of work and say they've just made slavery by another name. All kinds of clever things are done. The structure of the criminal justice system is completely changed to turn it into a system for punishing people who don't work either from plantations. The British government sends these independent inspectors of labour standards called magistrates out. They revive a colonial institution called the magistracy, which to British readers will still sound familiar. We still have a version of it in our criminal law today, where basically if you're a slave owner and you want to punish your slave, you're supposed to go to a magistrate, to an independent legal scholar who will give you a judgment and say whether you're being fair or not and what the fair punishment is. Slight flaws in the plan. 1, the magistrate is white. 2, the magistrate is wealthy. Therefore, these two things make him basically the same as the planter. Oh, and 3, in Jamaica, the guy dies almost as soon as he gets there, and no one else wants the job after that. So, it doesn't really work great. Yeah, it's quite, they send a few, and then when they start dying, they just don't replace them. It's great. But yes, so there is this transition system. This transition system fails so badly, the British government brings the date at which it will end forward 2 years. It's meant to end in 1840. It ends in 1838 by Act of Parliament. And there is actually a very beautiful celebration where apparently on the night, at midnight when they became free, rather than there being this very, very, you would imagine, joyous celebrations and wild parties and everyone drinking rum and so on, or whatever stereotypes people have in their mind of an enslaved plantation party would look like. Apparently people mostly en masse went down to their local church, whether that was a formal structure or something on the estate that they put together, because by this point a lot of enslaved people are Christians of some description, or certainly use Christianity as a cover, as a way of masking their own religion. And they have a vigil in honour of everyone who didn't make it that far. Which is an incredibly potent and beautiful moment in world history, I would say. That they don't just focus on their own newfound freedom, they honour and remember everyone who lived and died, for example, in 1831 in Mount Revolt, to make it possible. Which is fantastic.
So we've talked about how slavery is abolished. We have this apprenticeship system that also comes to an end, and then we're going to talk about the final example of today, which was the very darkly named killing time, I think.
Ah, yes, of course. Yes, the killing time. So I will guide us very quickly on the path to the killing time. So after this, in Jamaica in the 1840s and 1850s, we start to see the development of what Mimi Sheller calls peasant radicalism, of a more democratic culture in Jamaica where black people start to assert their interests. Because what happens in Jamaica after emancipation is that the white elite naturally, despite having had years to prepare for this, operate under the assumption that they can very easily corral their ex-slaves to carry on working for them as wage labour and offer appalling pay. They slash pay for apprenticeship. They say, oh, and you'll have to pay rent, if you want to keep that house of yours. I'm going to take your provision lands away from you, and so on. So in the British Caribbean, enslaved people always had land of their own to grow crops on, as a rule of thumb, especially in Jamaica, because Jamaica has an abundance of land. So these lands mean a lot to enslaved people because, it's like having a mini plantation. It's your own kingdom. It is your own place to decide what you grow, when you grow it, why you grow it. And it's actually a source of money. Many women go to the cities, even as slaves are allowed to, and exchange goods and sell things and so on. And this is partly why Jamaica is very good at fomenting revolution and in uprisings, because the women go off to the towns, and as they're exchanging their peppers for other goods, they're also telling them, oh, by the way, my husband's having a riot next Tuesday. Does yours want to go? It's great. But yes, so when this threat comes, the former slaves, former apprentices basically tell the white man where to go, and they head out into lots of abandoned land that's, well, not abandoned, it's never been used, and they start to make their own towns, settlements, farms, estates, etc., and live off those. So they're no longer, many of them, 2/3 of women especially, are no longer beholden to white landowners for their livelihood in the same way they are in, say, Barbados, where there is very little free land available. And this helps to start fostering this real democratic peasant culture in Jamaica, where people start asserting their own interests. We also start to see that because this is still, despite the economic shock of slavery's abolition, generally, as colonies go, quite prosperous place with big potentials to make money in the merchant trade and so on. We start to see a small, very small, but a distinct black middle class developing, or mixed race middle class developing in the cities of Jamaica. And through the 1840s, more and more black men start to qualify for the franchise. They start to meet very, very high standards for voting. Very few meet the standard for candidacy for election to the local parliament. That's income of £180 a year, property of £1,800 a year, or combined private and landed property of £3,000 a year, which is a lot of money at the time, by the way. So very few black people have a chance of getting into government, but they can start shaping what the government is doing. And our friends the Baptists kind of come back to get their revenge and start organising voter registration campaigns among this growing black middle class and saying, you have a say. I think we were around about 10 to 20,000 black men who were eligible to vote, and start trying to help them navigate the voter registration process and have their political say. This actually gets to the point where in 1844, the British governor of the island calls an early general election because he thinks if he waits till the legislature's term is up, the whites will lose. They will lose control of the legislature because of this voter registration campaign. That doesn't really happen, but through the 1840s, black people start to get this sense that they have a say in civic government. They can make change. At the same time, the white elite is trying to introduce more and more measures in the local government to preserve their increasingly precarious place. So they start to introduce punitive taxes on small estates. They try and punish small black farmers for daring to go off into the countryside and make their own destiny by making it, harder to sell their goods, or making them pay taxes whenever they buy equipment and so on. They are completely blind to the fact that as the island is going through this period of economic hardship, instead of supporting smallholders who have the potential to really transform the economy, they just keep supporting the white elite because they are the white elite. There is a limited concession from white people in the form of a political movement that we call the Town Party, which combines white commercial interests, so white shopkeepers, white traders, with the black middle class against the Country Party, who represent the plantocracy. But until very close to the revolt I'm about to talk to, they never get anything close to a majority in the House of Assembly. In the 1850s and 60s, there is a very sharp rise in anger at conditions in Jamaica, because this is a very hard time in Jamaica. There are lots of disasters. The country gets cholera from 1860 with the Civil War in the United States. The cost of clothing for workers starts surging because no one can get hold of cotton cheap. There are massive floods which wipe out the domestic food stock in a country that is already importing more food than it produces and has been doing for decades, because after slavery there was no longer profit in growing any kind of food. Conditions on the people who are still working for wage labor are getting harsher. The law is being tightened to make it easier to not pay your workers by saying they didn't work hard enough, therefore they shouldn't get paid this week, for example. And there is starting to become a land shortage, and land disputes are getting widespread between the boundaries of white estates and black communities who are growing and need more land to farm on. And this is very offensive to the moral economy of the Jamaican peasantry, who see land as the key to freedom. In 1859 and 1860, a man called Dr. Underhill, an English priest, I think he's Anglican, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure he's Anglican, visits Jamaica and produces this monumental report highlighting all of the ways in which Jamaica is economically and socially deficient. And uniquely, he basically takes the side of the black peasantry and blames the British government and the Jamaican government for gross economic mismanagement. This arrives at the same time as a group of several hundred peasants petitioned the British governor to say, the white elite in Jamaica are running this country into the ground. They're treating us absolutely awfully. Please do something about it. He is a very unsympathetic man. He very much takes the side of the white elite. And essentially, the Baptist War repeats itself, where a very large group of black people in Morant Bay in St. Thomas in the east decide that they are going to have a massive protest march. And they are going to march on the administrative centre of this parish, where the court is, where the local government runs its affairs. And they are just going to protest and demand better conditions for themselves, better wages, more jobs they want, land especially. A faction of those preemptively go to the local militia facility, to the local police station, to seize the weapons there so they can't be crushed as a revolt. And essentially it is a classic example of a protest where thousands and thousands of people turn out, and a few people perhaps make some bad decisions and start pelting rocks at British soldiers, who then believe that they're about to be murdered, and the entire thing turns into a bloodbath, into this horrifically violent riot, or rebellion, depending on your perspective. And there has been a very big debate in British scholarship, in British Caribbean scholarship, about whether or not it was a protest that turned into a riot, that turned into a rebellion, or if the people behind it always hoped it would turn into a violent uprising. And this does happen. I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on the details of the riots, but it spreads and property is destroyed. It is basically a repeat of the Baptist War. Property is destroyed. White people are terrorised, or feel terrorised, certainly. There's lots of fighting. It takes a little while to get it under control. There are very different perspectives all over. Lots of white apologist propaganda coming out to try and insist it was definitely a planned revolt. It was a coup. Historians generally think it probably wasn't. It was probably a mixture of some people who always had violent intentions and generally just a bursting of community outrage at conditions for the black peasantry and the black working class. What is actually fascinating is that we have a letter from one of the protesters. He was not terribly literate. It's quite hard to read, but in it, he talks about anger at the local government, about the House of Assembly, about how no one in there except for one white man called William Gordon, one mixed race man called William Gordon. Apart from him, no one cares about us. How can we expect the government to do anything? We need to take direct action to show you that we are the majority on this island. He has a fascinating line where he actually says that the protest has come about as a result of an alliance between black working class people and white people who work for wages, which is an incredibly, if you're a Marxist historian, that is just kind of the dream, to find an ordinary black man articulating this thought. The letter is anonymous. We have no idea what happened to him, but it's a really fascinating insight into just one of those people who was marching with a torch that day when the violence broke out. And just like the Baptist War, at the end of it, there is this horrific campaign of violent persecution, and it makes the Baptist War look like child's play. There is a prison facility which is essentially converted into a concentration camp. The governor of the island, I always forget his first name. I think he's Edward John Eyre, but I always want to call him John Eyre, but I think he's Edward John Eyre, declares martial law, even though that is not one of his powers as governor, at the time, in quite the same way, without consulting the imperial government. And the campaign of violence is horrific. And what is interesting, and this is where we kind of tie our story together from the start, is believing this could be the beginning of a revolution, because it is the biggest uprising in Caribbean history. Believing that this could be the beginning of a revolution that destroys white imperial control, British imperial control in the region, he sends his deputy to the Maroons. And he says, we made a deal with you, way back when. It is time for you to honour this deal. Now, the Maroons had played a role in repressing the Baptist War, but not a very enthusiastic one. This time, the Maroons see what is happening, the scale of the unrest and discontent, as a threat to their survival, because they are very worried that if they don't cooperate, either once the revolt is crushed, they will be crushed next, or if the revolt is a success, when the British come, the British aren't going to care what a Maroon is, they're just going to see black skin. So the Maroons put together basically a group of people who go with British soldiers and essentially go village by village in the area where the unrest is worst and murder everyone they see. They burn houses down, they murder civilians, they murder children. It is an extremely, extremely horrific event that the local black population called the killing time because of the sheer scale of violence that was targeted against them. We are not talking about like the Baptist War, where at least there was some degree of due process. There was an attempt to use the courts. We are talking about people being sent to this one prison where they are basically killed or tortured in rotation. We are talking about the mass destruction of villages. This all because, some 200 estates have been damaged. It was a very, very big act of unrest in the end, and the campaign of persecution that follows is absolutely horrific.
Do we have any estimates for how many people died because of this repression?
Again, it's very difficult because no one's keeping proper records. It was considered it's a very small island, so when you say hundreds, that might not sound that bad. That's actually quite a massive, massive amount of people to be killing in the way these communities are laid out. Certainly, probably thousands and thousands of people were victims of torture or violence. How many died? We don't know, but thousands and thousands of victims of violence, certainly. Excuse me. The governor basically allows the people who he puts in charge of the persecution to have a free hand. One of these people is probably a mentally unwell alcoholic, and he runs that kind of prison camp. We have records of defences in local newspapers written by white people of what was happening, which later the authors of which said, I only wrote that because if I didn't write it, I was told I would end up in the same prison camp that these people are being tortured and killed in. It's a really, really horrific. It's not a genocide, but it is bad enough that back in Britain, there is a campaign set up by a group of members of parliament who call themselves the Jamaica Committee to have the governor tried for mass murder and executed or sent to jail, because the stories that flow out are just so incredibly terrible that the British public is, just like with the Baptist War, once again horrified. Now, this is significant to the story we're trying to tell today, in that, once again, this makes the British government completely reevaluate its policy towards Jamaica and to the British Caribbean. And until this point, white Jamaicans have been very proud of their autonomy. There were always during the end days of slavery conversations about Jamaica becoming a state of the United States, or declaring independence, or even having its own war of independence. There was a very memorable article in the 1820s, I think it was, where a Jamaican writer said that no one cares what Britain thinks, but Britain will care what our 20,000 guns and bayonets think if they try too hard. Those sentiments never go anywhere in the end, but these are white people who are very proud of their Jamaican identity. Even some of the people who've been absentee planters, they still see themselves as British, but they are proud to be British in Jamaica, and they think the British government is the one that loses its way, not them. The British government decides it has had enough of these people, and that as a result of how they've handled the events at Morant Bay, which I didn't explain, the events at Morant Bay, the flashpoint, the trigger was a trial of a black man, which no one believed was going to be conducted fairly. It stems from, it's an example of one case where people lost faith in the political process and all of their anger, and it just boiled out at once. The British government persuades the white Jamaican elite to vote to abolish their own government, because if they don't, then the British government is willing to consider leaving them at the mercy of all of these unruly black protesters. And the Jamaican legislature concedes, enthusiastically at the time, later with profound regret on part of this white elite. But it is another remarkable example of black resistance, first being misunderstood. It probably was not an attempt to seize control of the island. It probably was not an attempt to overthrow the British Empire. On the whole, we find that black resistance in Jamaica, that they express some degree of loyalty and affection for the empire. They blame the local authorities, not the British authorities, for their problems. And it culminates in the complete destruction of white self-government in Jamaica. From the 1860s onwards, they are a crown colony. They are controlled completely centrally by the imperial government through the governorship, Governor Aya is dismissed. He does not enjoy the benefit of any of this power. A new governor is brought in. And then from Jamaica, the British government follows suit one by one with every colony it has except Bermuda. Only Bermuda survives this process of the British government basically saying, these people have made a shambles of this region, we need to step in and fix it. And it all stems, probably without the events at Morant Bay, without the violent persecution that followed, without the violence of the Maroons against other black people, Jamaica's House of Assembly probably would have clung on for much, much longer, because ultimately it was difficult to abolish it without their consent.
Wow. And I had no idea. I mean, I don't know, I admittedly don't know much about British Caribbean history, but I'd always understood it to be after the 1830s that the autonomy and later independence that was granted to these ex-colonies was kind of a strategic move as a part of decolonization or something like that.
Yeah. So to an extent, that's right, and that's the part that we don't really have time to talk about, but that, suffice to say, that also comes about because of black labour unrest. That's in the 1930s, but in the 19th century, it's very understandable. There is a general assumption that through the 19th century, the British Empire's power is starting to fray, it's starting to fall apart at the edges, it's on a path of inevitable decline. Not the case in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, the imperial government is in ascendancy. It is taking control. It is centralising its authority. It is strengthening the power of its governors. It does keep input from the local community in the form of appointed lawmaking bodies, but those bodies are structured in such a way that the governor always has the final say. They can advise only, not make decisions. And as a result of Governor Eyre having played such a decisive role in repressing the Morant Bay uprising, the British government makes sure its governors are people who it can trust much more, who it can control directly much more as well. So it defies expectations, it defies the narrative empire, and it is only much later on that we begin to see a return to representative government in the Caribbean and a reduction in imperial power. That's a 20th century phenomenon, and that culminates in the 1930s and 40s, with basically a massive series of labour rights in the 1930s, not unlike anything that we've talked about today, where there's lots of violence, but where the government is not as harsh in its repression, and where it allows black people to start forming lasting political communities, to form trade unions, to form political parties. And that then sets the region on the path to independence, well, certainly to democracy and then independence. And that culminates in 1944 in Jamaica with the first Jamaican general election, in which everyone can vote on equal terms to everyone else.
And wait, going back to an earlier part of this last incident, the Killing Time, or this last major issue that we've talked about. At one point, you said you said rebellion. You said riot was also used in historiography. What would you think would be the most appropriate term here? Riot or rebellion? I mean, before they were brutally suppressed, because it sounds like it wasn't just a show when the rioting broke out. It wasn't just a show of discontent. It was politically motivated actions, right? So that wouldn't that make it closer to a rebellion?
It's a tricky one, because I think it depends on. Generally, the debate is over how far it was planned. Now, Gad Human, who is the definitive writer of this, The Killing Time is the name of his book on this subject, and it is a stellar read, by the way. I did double check, actually. The death toll in the repression is estimated at about 550 people formally, probably more informally, and especially when you include people who weren't executed, who later died from injury and so on, with thousands of victims of violence. Gad Human says it's characterised by advanced planning and organisation, and we do have some degree of evidence of that. Probably the narrative we go with now mostly is that the demonstration began as a demonstration. It was a protest, fundamentally, that became a riot at that moment, and when that flashpoint happened, it then evolved into a rebellion. So I think they're all, again, it seems like a cop-out, but I think it misses the point. I think it's something that went through stages. And I think, not wanting to be too anachronistic, but you could draw comparisons of what happened in Tunisia this decade, where one man's protest turns into a demonstration, which turns into a riot, which turned into the overthrowing of an entire government. I think it's a very similar kind of phenomenon. It's very hard to say for certain whether or not they always had a plan for this massive violent uprising in St. Thomas in the East, or if it was just a protest that they happened to coordinate really well that just went awry at the end. If you had to give it a name, I would say call it a rebellion. It was a rebellion. It was people rebelling against the corruption, the decadence of racism of the order of the time. And there's an interesting side point as well, actually. I'd mentioned that there was a lot of anti-Semitism involved in this. There was a lot of the governor accused Jewish people of being involved in cementing unrest, and there was a Jewish member in the House of Assembly who had been arguing for a few years beforehand that Jamaica was on a bad path because of the mismanagement of the administration, and that they needed to pay more attention to the needs of black people and of working class people on the island, which is an interesting undercurrent through what you think of as a very literally black and white racial issue.
Yeah. And it's surprising, and it's still also not surprising to hear that any anti-Semitism managed to find its way into this.
Yep, it's an amazingly horrifically consistent feature of history, isn't it? Governor he essentially said that the local newspapers were controlled by the Jews. They weren't. And all of the malice that was coming out against him was a Jewish conspiracy, or a mixed race conspiracy. Occasionally mixed race people were also blamed as well. And it hadn't happened like that. And it was fascinating. It's fascinating, but, I just thought it was worth mentioning that at the end.
Yeah. The Spanish Civil War in the middle of the 20th or the beginning of the 20th century in the 1930s, the official explanation of the Francoist regime, which lasted until 1975, upon Franco's death, the official explanation for what they were fighting against was it was an international Judeo-Masonic Marxist conspiracy.
Oh, my favourite kind of conspiracy.
Just like everybody in there.
Let's just Jewish and Mason. There's just a lot to unpack in there alone, and then let's get to Mason and Marxist.
Exactly.
Okay. That's a lot of wow.
Yeah, and keep in mind, taught as official doctrine, that is like the official version of history until 1975 when Franco dies. I mean, he kind of like slowed his roll on the Jewish part after a certain point, because after 1945,
it lost its vogue.
It was like I think they kind of realized it was a bad look at the very least, and they kind of like lowered the profile of their anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
But God,
that's incredible. But wow. But yeah, so that was my quick fire tour through some of the examples of unrest in Jamaica and how they shaped British imperial policy. On the off chance for anyone out there is listening and happens to know about these things, yes, this has been quite a simple overview. And the whole point is to draw patterns. It's not a very detailed treatment. If people have more questions about specific incidents, I am very happy to write them reams and reams and reams, on the thread. But this has been a very basic quick fire. Let's go through a tour of some stuff, because people don't know a lot about the British Caribbean. Well, I thought it would be a really cool way to highlight the way in which black people in the Caribbean, in slavery and out of slavery, were able to actually have a lasting impact on the British Empire, on how it dealt with its colonies, on how those colonies individually and as a whole were run. So it's, if I've slipped up in simplifying, tell me, and I'll apologise, but I don't think I have. And I'll be very happy to sit down and give anyone very detailed answers about any of these or one aspect of these, off the podcast.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very important episode to have, because so much of historiography, it has kind of underplayed the agency of, not always like some of these, the agency of, black people, enslaved black people who are being exploited in, the apprenticeship regime and all these other things, it's often underplayed the agency they have. And while not, like in the cases we talked about today, it wasn't always a premeditated, we'll rise up, we'll get massacred, and then we'll move the timetable up. No, it was the rebellions that were trying to change things politically, and even if they didn't always turn out exactly as, they think they had originally planned it, it's certainly not a case of them being passive recipients of the enlightened policies of the metropole. They were active parts in moving the international discussion of, the discussion in England about these policies and moving them forward.
Yeah, exactly. And as I touched on earlier, they certainly, the more well-educated or the people who had access to the white elite in their daily life, they were aware of what was happening in England. They didn't exist removed from it. They were hearing these conversations that the people who claimed to own them were having, and they were talking about them and debating them and, learning that there were people in England on their side and so on. So they were, even if in England there was no awareness of how much that was happening on the ground, for enslaved people themselves, they were part of that political discussion. They were having conversations about British parliamentary debates, much like I might have today with my family in a way, obviously about much more serious issues and things that impacted them far worse. But they were part of that process. They weren't removed from it. They weren't people at the side who white people just spoke about. And that's important for people to be aware of and keep in mind, because it's very easily lost in colonial history. And in a way, in the British Caribbean, we are probably quite lucky that we have, because we look at quite small places, we can really, really see the impact. I mean, geographically small, not small in any other sense. The impact these people had when they did act in a way that maybe can get lost in the historiography of such a big place like the continent of Africa, because that's what all African history is reduced to, right? It's Africa is a country. And in the same way, India, it's fragmented and very high barrier to access the historiography of. I think the British Caribbean is a very powerful way of understanding this role marginalised people have to play in shaping imperial policy, discourse, etc.
Excellent point. And I think with that, we're going to leave off for today. Sowser, thanks again for coming on and chatting with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been great fun.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.